This hat has a slightly unusual construction in that the body is knit flat and seamed, then it's joined, and the rest of the hat for the crown is knit in the round. I'll show you how to work the seam and to join it, and you can either make this hat or maybe design one for yourself. I'll show you the technique I like to use to seam hats. Here you can see in this diagram there's the ribbing area, then the body of the hat, and then the crown. Now, for patterns that are knit flat to begin with, you have to seam them. But I don't care to seam my hats all the way to the top. I would much prefer to seam just the flat part and then join and knit the rest of the crown in the round. I just think it's a lot more fun and I like the results. So I'm going to use my mixer hat, which is a companion piece for my book Reversible Scarves, and I'll show you what I mean by this seam. As you can see for my mixer hat, I worked it flat, the ribbing and the body of the hat, and the reason for that is that I need for the stitch pattern to match up along the edges. Now, if I had knit this hat in the round, because knitting in the round actually creates a spiral, the pattern would have been off by a row. So that's why sometimes you have to knit something flat and then seam it together so that all the edges match up properly. As you can see, once I worked the ribbing and the body of the hat flat, I put all the live stitches on waste yarn. And that's so that I can easily seam up the edges, and then later I'll join it and work it in the round for the crown of the hat. Now in my pattern, I call for an extra stitch along each edge, and those stitches are what I will use for the mattress stitch for seaming. As you can see, I have seamed the hat all the way up to this point. I used contrasting colored yarn just to show you what I was up to. You, of course, will use the same colored yarn as you did for the rest of your hat. Now I've tightened up the rest of my seam, and I am going to leave my seaming yarn in the front while I work on the rest of my hat. My next step is to return the live stitches that are on the waste yarn here back to the needle that I was going to use for the rest of my hat. And I like to start with a circular, and as it gets smaller I'll switch to double pointed. But you can see we're going to just return these stitches to the needle like this. Now I like to use smooth contrasting colored waste yarn, and I tend to pick up the stitches while the waste yarn is still in there, just in case I make a mistake. But you also have to make sure not to stab the waste yarn or split it along the way. And then I can pull a little bit of it out as I go. And I'll show you what that looks like when I get all the way around to the beginning. As you can see, I have returned all the live stitches back to my circular needle. So everything's back on. And I just have a little bit more of the waste yarn to pull out, like that. And now we won't need that anymore. And you can see that we have the seam running down the inside of the hat here. And now we're going to work the stitches so that we can get the hat ready to work in the round. Our first quandary is, you remember we had selvage stitches that we used to seam the flat part of the hat. Well, now that means we've got too many stitches on our needles, because we've got one selvage stitch at each end that we don't need anymore because we'll be knitting in the round. And this will return us to the right number of stitches for knitting in the round. So to get rid of these selvage stitches, what we're going to do is on the first two, there we go, we're going to knit those together. So we've gotten rid of the selvage on this end of the needle. And now we're going to start knitting the hat in the round so that we can work the crown. And we'll work all the way around. And because we're going in this direction, it's probably a good time to remind everybody that it's a good idea to end the flat part of the body of a hat on a right side row so that your yarn is in position to continue knitting just straight across when you get to the knitting in the round part. Alright, now I have knitted all the way till I'm almost at the end of my first row of knitting in the round, if that makes sense. I guess it's a row till I join it. And I'm going to finish my last couple of stitches and end at 2 stitches before the end of the round. Now, just as with the other side, we still have a selvage stitch to contend with to get the stitch count back to the right number for knitting in the round. So this time we're going to do an SSK to get rid of that selvage stitch. Just like that. Now we're going to place a stitch marker to mark the beginning of the round and just keep going until we start our decreases for the crown of the hat. Now I'm still leaving my seaming yarn in front because I'm going to use it to finish up the seam and make sure where the 2 decrease stitches meet that there's a solid join. We don't want any holes there, which we see right here. So that's what we're going to use the end of the seaming yarn for. But from here on, we're going to just knit in the round just like you would any hat that doesn't have a seam. Oops, get this guy back to the front. Now that we've knit a couple of rounds, there's a little bit more seaming housekeeping to take care of, and that is to close the gap where the decreases were from before, where we decreased out those selvage stitches. So just taking my seaming yarn, I'm going to go back in between the selvage stitch, the old selvage stitch that you can see there, and the first stitch of the knitting. Just as you would with the regular mattress stitch, I'm going to go under the next bar, like that. And then I go to the other side and do the same thing. I find the bar between the selvage and the first stitch in. It's a little trickier once you've joined it, but you'll get there. There we go, like that. And just as we would for any seam, we'll tighten that up a little bit and go back into the same hole that we had before that the seaming yarn came out of. And there. That makes for a nice smooth join, and I'll be knitting the rest of the hat in the round, which pleases me greatly because I like that. And I'll show you the results when I'm done. As you can see, I've finished the hat off. I worked the rest of the crown in the round in stockinette, and I was able to make these nice even decreases. Now this method isn't going to work for all hats, especially if they have a lot of patterning up in the crown, but where you have the pattern predominantly on just the body of the hat, and you can work the crown in the round like this, I think it's a really fun way to do hats. And you can use it on other designs or designs that you make up yourself. I hope you enjoy that. If you like this hat and would like to get the pattern for it, it's available on Ravelry or also through my website, oddknits.com. And there are mittens that go along with it. Both are accessories that are meant to match the mixer pattern in my book, Reversible Scarves, Curing the Wrong Side Blues.